the movement for Black Lives space, I think, is an interesting one. It includes mostly Black-led organizations, so there's some multicultural organizations, and it's rooted in this moment, in people's reaction to, in people's organizing around, in people's incredible work in the last few years, and then the deep history of that work as well, locally and nationally. But people who came to the table didn't necessarily share an ideology. I think that there was a pretty clear sense of what all of us were against. There was a pretty clear sense and analysis that this problem was not just about police violence. There was a pretty clear sense and analysis that the systems we are inside of are fundamentally anti-Black systems and fundamentally racialized and based on racialized capitalism. The analysis around anti-capitalism, the analysis around abolition, those are things that people came to the table without necessarily discussing. And I think, to be fair to this moment, people came to the streets without discussing their ideologies around anti-capitalism or around abolition. And so it was a formation of groups who were doing work, and that we came together to think about how our work aligned. And through that process, I think I was pleasantly surprised. And the idea for us was that there are people who are united despite different ideologies, who are pushing for reforms that are false solutions and that actually, for their detriment, and dehumanize and divest from our people and surveil and make lines in the sand about who is disposable. There were things that all of us were really clear we were against, I think. But I think it was the way that I have experienced much of the movement in the last few years is that there were, in different places, are different levels of articulation and different levels of politics around what it is that we're actually imagining and envisioning. And so I think for us, the idea, because we were rooted, number one, in this principle of centering the struggle by those most impacted and having that be the authority and that be the genesis and that be what we're elevating. And number two, basing the Movement for Black Lives platform on actual work that was happening and on communities who had bases and who were building bases and having, that it was part of those conversations. And lastly, that we were refusing to not resist the false solutions that were being proposed, both in our name and other people's names. And so that was really kind of the principles that brought us together. And I think together, and so there was a huge range of groups. There were groups who do mass organizing at the national level. There were groups who are digital groups. There were groups who have small bases that are incredibly radical and incredibly attached and incredibly fluent in political education and abolition and anti-capitalism. And there are groups who have huge bases, who have all different sorts of ideas and work inside the system. And so it was an interesting, but they were Black groups, and they were groups who had been catalyzed by this moment and who were collectively outraged. So I think what came out of that was a series of policies that was not necessarily rooted in an ideology, although there are ideologies that come through that are very clear, because there were principles. There were principles around that we don't believe in or want to accept the consolidation of corporate or state power. There were principles around that nobody is disposable, that we have seen over and over again. People get thrown under the bus for reforms, and we're not interested in piecemeal reforms that don't move us towards a different kind of system. We were clear that what we sought was a transformation of power relationships and not just a reform in material conditions. So I feel like there were principles or visions or ideas that underrode a lot of it, but there wasn't necessarily really clear political alignment around what we name those principles always, or what that is called, or what the language we use for that is. And I think the ANC is an example of that, of a broad-based coalition that was in opposition to an oppressive, repressive regime, and had principles around how they did their work, but was broad-based in who was part of that. And then BLC is a different kind of example. And so I feel like for us, the idea was to try and do some of that struggle together and be real that people don't come into the room in the same place, and we may end up in different places, but it's really important that we try our best to name the work we're going to do together and what's possible inside of that. And then be really clear about some bottom line principles. And for us, those were principles kind of basic dignity and human rights, and a shared goal of we would not continue to watch the placing of profit over people, and how does that actually play out locally, and how do we actually wage those battles locally? And folks do that differently in different places. That the situation in Minneapolis is different than the situation in New York, which is definitely different than the situation in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so how do we create a set of principles and a set of ideas that has some through line through all of that, but also has an acceptance and a willingness to struggle around tactics and not mistaking the tactics that we employ for the principles that we employ. And then also, I think, doing political education that's not based in kind of jargon, but spaced actually in people's walk, and what does this idea mean for the work that you're doing. So all that to say, I mean, I think the platform is interesting, and there were pushes from both sides about how explicit we should be in our language versus how explicit we should be in our policies. And I think that what held the groups together was not a shared tactic or shared conditions in the kind of most specific political sense, but instead this set of principles that was developed that were really important, I think, and will be really important moving forward in terms of like what it is that we settle for, and how do we actually, considering the political moment, considering that like we are in a country where a majority of white voters voted for white supremacy, and we are now like watching the complacency of that. And white supremacy is deeply rooted in criminalization. It's deeply indebted to and uses the prison industrial complex and the cultural values that underlie that as tools against our people. And so being really clear about what we are not compromising on feels really important.